I would love to tell you that by the time you're finished installing 250 square feet of flooring like this, that you're going to be able to stand up and stand back and fully appreciate how nice it looks without also being aware that your back hurts and your fingers and wrists are tired and sore. Your body will pretty much be letting you know that it didn't really appreciate you deciding that laying a floor like this was a great idea. Maybe it's just me, but I don't think so. Unless you install this type of flooring all the time and are also used to doing the work, I think you're going to feel it regardless of your age. But maybe for me, reaching that milestone of 65 a couple of months ago contributed to my mental mindset that set me up for this. I mean, I didn't have to agree to do this for the customer. I was just finishing up the master bath remodel that's connected to this room and thought, what the heck, I can knock this out in no time. While the flooring did install pretty easily and quickly, by the time I was finished with painting the room, installing the floor and closet, running the floor trim, and installing the barn door, I was totally wiped. Hopefully I haven't discouraged you younger folks from doing this. You're young and it's really not a big price to pay to end up with some really good looking results. Whereas I felt like I'd been run over by a Ford F-250, you might only feel like you've been sideswiped by a Volkswagen Beetle or something like that. All I can say to you older folks like me is to use a thimbleful of that wisdom you've been storing up for all these years and then just grit your teeth and go at it. All right, so let me give you some of the details on installing the flooring. I've not done much of this engineered flooring because most of the floors I've installed over the years have been actual hardwood. What I can say about this particular product is that it was pretty much perfect. I mean, the pieces are straight, its locking mechanism for the pieces was mostly flawless, and once I got going with it and figured out the right angle to insert the pieces together by, it went really smoothly. My biggest complaint is that the boxes themselves are heavy, weighing, I think the guy at the warehouse said, in the range of about 80 pounds each, which means that when you break that down to individual pieces, the pieces themselves are pretty dense feeling and heavy. Now this is a floating floor, which means that while all the pieces interlock with each other, they are not actually attached to the floor. So you don't jam them up against the wall or even start laying the floor with a chalk line necessarily. But where I started, I left about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch space between the wall and flooring. I used shims to get my first row laid as straight as possible. If that first row is not straight, that begins to be reflected in the next row and following rows because the interlocking of the pieces doesn't work out right. By that I mean that after I got the first 3 rows or so put together so that the joints were snugged up against each other, because the pieces are so uniform and precise, I pretty much had my straight line to continue adding other pieces to the floor. So all I had to do was to put shims or wood spacers against the wall to push the floor up against, and after that I didn't have any problem with aligning the next pieces of flooring. Not sure if that makes complete sense, but basically with the floor floating and not being attached anywhere, once you start getting a good bit of it put down and interlocked, the weight of the floor keeps it from moving as you continue to build the floor out. Now I'm doing a lot of tapping on the floor pieces to snug them up, and I'm using a piece of 2x4 block to do that. I had originally cut a notch in it to match the thickness of the wood flooring, but that turned out to be useless. The more accustomed I got to interlocking the pieces together, the more I figured out the right way to do it without destroying the edges of the flooring out of frustration. What I found is if you hold the back side of the piece of the flooring up at about a 20-degree angle or so, and while holding it, place the block against that edge and tap it with the hammer, generally the piece snaps right into place very nicely. Since the ends of the flooring also interlock, the instructions said to snap the flooring together lengthwise and then tap the end of the piece against the previous piece until it snaps into place. Well, that absolutely did not work for me with this flooring, and that was probably the only point at which I was ready to sling my hammer through the wall because I couldn't get it to happen without fouling up the end of the flooring I was pounding on, and I still couldn't get it as tight as I wanted. So I found that if I slipped the pieces together end to end and tried to get it as close as I could to snapping in place lengthwise, that I could hold the pieces up at the angle, tap with the block, and actually get it to go into place more times than not. Of course, the longer the pieces were, because of the flex in the flooring, the more of a hassle it became. But by the time I was about halfway done, I'd pretty well figured it out. So you can see at times I'm actually lifting up several pieces to that 20-degree angle and tapping, and sometimes that was all that was necessary to pop them in place. With a longer piece, if I held it up at the angle and tapped the full length of it, then went back and tapped down the length again, most of the time that allowed it to snap in place just perfectly. If it seemed it wanted to raise up a little bit and not lay flat, I would take the block and lay it on its side, tap it on top of the floor at the joints, and get it to lay down flat that way. When it came to making cuts, I started with drawing a line on the flooring where I wanted to make the cut, and then using this multi-tool with a new blade on it to make the cuts, and that worked out just fine, so I never explored any other option. Plus, I was able to make the cuts in the room where I'm installing without making too much noise or sending cuttings off of the saw blade all over the room. This multi-tool is one tool I never thought I would buy or have much use for. But once I got one, I found that I use it all the time, and it's probably my favorite tool because of its versatility. I also used it on this job for cutting off the door jambs to be able to slip the flooring underneath the wood trim. The rest of the process is to just keep doing what you've been doing. This particular style of flooring has 3 different widths, so depending on the product you're using, you'll want to alternate each row of flooring with a different width of material if that applies to your situation. You also want to stagger the joints between rows so that they don't align too closely with each other from row to row. You can control this by making a cut at the beginning of the row to ensure that you're able to offset joints on the row you're installing from joints on the prior row. The white product I'm putting down is a thick paper vapor barrier that I just staple in place. It has some sort of silicone coating on it that makes it easy to slide the flooring across. One thing you want to be careful of is that the edge of this paper is thick enough and sharp enough to give you a pretty good slice if you're not careful when handling it. I've worked with it enough that I know better these days, so I was able to make it through this installation without any loss of blood. When I got down to the last row, it was close enough to lunchtime that I took enough pieces of the flooring with me back to the shop and ran them through the table saw rather than using the multi-tool to cut them to width. So that saved me some time there. I left about 1/4 of an inch of play between the wall and edge of the flooring, so those last pieces slipped in easily as well, and I was able to use the wall to push against them to snap them into place. Now on this job I had some other things to do in the room itself, like paint the walls and move some electrical plugs around, so I pulled the base trim along with the carpet and planned to run new trim on top of the wood floor. So I didn't have to worry about making real precise cuts up against the wall because first of all it is a floating floor, and secondly the base trim was going to cover the edge of the flooring anyway. If that had not been the case and I had left the base trim down, I would have installed 1/4 round molding painted to match the base trim and run it on top of the floor to cover the edge of the flooring. The final product turned out looking really great. We added a barn door on the closet made from 1¼ inch solid alder hardwood, which stains up pretty dramatically and complements the wood floor very nicely. The finish on the barn door is satin polyacrylic. The homeowner had great instincts about design and colors, and her choices ended up making a really nice look. As always, I hope you found something helpful in this video, and I appreciate you watching.